The United Nations calls for an investigation into targeting aid workers. US Senator urges halt to offensive weapons sales to Israel. And Lebanon calls for exerting pressure on Israel to end repeated attacks. Hello there, good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock Cairo local time and you're watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest on Gaza. The Israeli occupation military has intensified its ground offensive in northern Gaza, advancing into al-Shujaiya neighborhood east of Gaza City. Reports from local sources indicate that Israeli forces have entered the densely populated area, conducting heavy airstrikes and shelling residential zones, forcing civilians to flee as the violence escalates. This marks the 18th month of ongoing attacks in the region. The UN Security Council has convened an emergency session to address Israel's escalating aggression against Palestinians. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk warned that Israel's siege on Gaza could constitute using starvation as a war tactic and condemned the killing of aid workers. He called for an urgent condemned forced evacuations and criticized Israeli officials' rhetoric on annexation. Turk urged immediate humanitarian access and reminded states of their legal duty to prevent atrocities.
Killings of 15 medical personnel and humanitarian aid workers.
President of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, Dr. Yunus al-Khatib, has called for an independent investigation into Israel's occupation's crimes in Gaza and accountability for those responsible. That came during an emergency session convened by the UN Security Council, where he highlighted that 30 members of their staff were lost before the attack on Tel Sultan neighborhood in the Palestinian side of Rafah. Al-Khatib also emphasized that Israel has imposed a complete blockade on Gaza for over a month, violating international humanitarian law. Al-Khatib called for an end to attacks on aid workers and for those responsible for killing aid workers in Gaza to be held accountable.
And staff whose main mission is to save lives. During the darkest time.
UNOA Commissioner General Felipe Lazzarini has condemned Israel for using food and humanitarian aid as weapons in Gaza. He highlighted the ongoing humanitarian crisis caused by Israel's 18-month siege, which has resulted in widespread hunger, despair, and a lack of essential goods. Lazzarini called for an end to the blockade, urging that aid will be allowed to reach Gaza and the siege lifted to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population.
The more we go ahead, the more we will see the impact.
The Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has condemned Israel's ongoing massacres against civilians in Gaza, particularly the horrific attack on Dar al-Akram school, which housed displaced people. The initial toll reported 27 deaths, mostly women and children, with many bodies mutilated and burned. Over 100 others were injured. The ministry called for accountability for war criminals and international protection for Palestinians, criticizing the international community for its inaction and complicity in Israel's actions. Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Abul-Gheit has said that Israel's ongoing wars across Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Syria, have entered a new phase of blatant aggression. He condemned Israel's repeated violations of agreements, the killing of civilians, and disregard for international law. Abul-Gheit warned of the global consequences of inaction, stressing that Israel's war machine seeks to exacerbate its internal crises by escalating violence and displacement in Gaza. The Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said that Israel's attacks on regional countries have become the greatest threat to regional security and contribute to chaos. It emphasized that the international community must take responsibility to prevent Israel's increasingly reckless aggression. The Foreign Ministry's statement criticized Israel's officials for hiding the genocide in Gaza, their war against Palestinians, settler terrorism, and expansionist ambitions, particularly in Syria and Lebanon, urging Israel to end its occupation and destabilizing policies. US Senator Peter Welch has urged senators to vote to stop the sale of offensive weapons to Israel. That came at the time where the Trump administration continues its strong support for Israel in its conflict with Gaza. But some arms deals being presented to Congress are facing opposition from certain lawmakers who are calling for a halt. Welch criticized Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's bombing campaign and demanded that the Israeli military be denied such arms.
We're hopeful that she's going to come back.
Senator, would you want to see Clarence Thomas appear before this committee on the Supreme Court's ethic? Is it better if she retired?
She's got to make her own decision on that. None of us want to be pushing her. We got a problem here, obviously, because we have a 10-10 situation.
International Criminal Court lawyer Michael Qnews has stated that Hungary is not the only country withdrawing from the ICC, and others may follow suit. Qnews emphasized that Hungary's decision is primarily political. He also noted that US President Trump is taking countermeasures against the court. He called for the ICC member states to enforce the arrest warrant against Netanyahu, highlighting the charges against Netanyahu's government and military for alleged genocide in Gaza. Israeli protesters have clashed with police in Tel Aviv during an anti-government rally outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party headquarters. The protest was joined by families of detainees held by Hamas and demonstrators condemning Netanyahu's European visit. Tensions rise as bombings in Gaza intensify and Netanyahu faces controversy over a potential plot to remove Shin Bet head Ronen Bar. Now, for analysis on the situation, we go across to the newsroom where Selma Marwan is waiting for us. Selma.
Thank you, Mark. And for further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by Al-Ahram newspaper managing editor, Ashraf El-Ashri. Mr. Ashraf, thank you so much for joining us on Qnews. And let me start off by asking you, how do you view Israel's attempts to isolate the Palestinian side of Rafah area from the rest of the Gaza Strip?
Absolutely, this the attempt, unfortunately, in the new military administration is trying to prove himself, and he's drawing new schemes in regards to the military operations. And these new evacuations is a new scheme of the Chief of Staff to take control over Gaza, north and south. And the same scheme was attempted to be implemented in 2005 and 2003, and they resorted now to closing the crossings and trying to internally evacuate Palestinians to impose their complete control into Gaza, turning it into an uninhabitable area for the military troops to be centralized within Gaza. And this will worsen the position of Hamas to help Israel to go bring back the detainees. And I think there will be a lot of negative implications with hundreds of martyrs in Palestine in exchange for continuation of the military operation without any political settlement, and the United States is providing the political cover for it.
Yes, speaking of military operations, reference to Israel launching fireballs on Dar al-Arqam yesterday, how do you view this attack?
It's not only Dar al-Arqam, there is also the clinic massacre one day before. About 90 to 120 killed. These numbers are terrifying, and unfortunately the international community stands silent and helpless without any pressures applied on Netanyahu, because they are afraid of the Trump administration and any sanctions that might be imposed on any party to condemn Israel currently or in the near future. This administration is controlled by the far-right officials who are harnessing all the military and political powers of Israel with the excuse of self-defense, but Netanyahu is taking advantage of this for more killings and to eliminate all channels and tools of resistance, whether in Gaza Strip or Syria and Lebanon, and now the battle with Iran in the next stage. So the Middle East is going for the worst due to the political cover provided by the United States. It turned now into a genocide in the enclave.
Yeah, so Israel has stated that it will not stop its military operations in Gaza until all detainees are released. However, what are the strategic objectives of Israel?
Israel does not want to go back to negotiation. They have the opportunity to go back and to resume for a second stage in accordance with the agreement held in Doha in 19th January with the Egyptian Qatari mediation. Netanyahu does not want to go back to these peace negotiations because it will be the end of the government and the resignation of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and the prosecution of Benjamin Netanyahu due to political corruption charges, in addition to bribery and other corruption charges. That's why he wants to continue the war for as long as possible to overcome any political or military prosecutions. Also, he's reaping the fruits of his government leading this war. So any attempts for the resumption of negotiation are doomed to fail. In order to pressure the U.S., now the international community has only to pressure the U.S. and Netanyahu to go back to the negotiation path. Israel has rejected a lot of proposals for the resumption of negotiations for any exchange of detainees and the resumption of the peace truce, but Israel is rejecting all of these attempts, and there must be U.S. guarantees to pressure Israel to go back to the negotiations and withdraw from the Gaza Strip to have a peaceful exchange of detainees and prisoners.
Reference to the current massive protests taking place in Israel accusing Netanyahu's far-right government of going against democracy, could these protests lead to a halt in the war on the Gaza Strip?
Of course, these protests are increasing by the second. The families of the detainees and also the ones who got killed in Gaza have organized huge protests in front of the government headquarters and the Knesset to demand Netanyahu to stop the war, and they accused him of lying to the Israeli people and accused them of not providing any positive negotiations and also demanding the resumption of negotiations and not stalling for the war to continue further for his political and personal gains, according to the families of the detainees. They also said that he is stalling and is not seeking to bring back the detainees, and he rejects to send an Israeli delegation to negotiate with all powers with the mediators in Qatar. The families of the detainees is now sending daily messages to Trump to intervene and to pressure Netanyahu and to rescue the negotiations. And now Netanyahu is heading next week to the United States, and he's going to meet President Trump to discuss the genocide taking place daily in Gaza.
From Cairo, that was Al Ahram newspaper managing editor. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News. And now we go back to Mark in our studio.
Thank you very much, Salma. Thank you very much indeed. Now let's get the latest from Lebanon.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Israeli warplanes have targeted a residential building in Sidon in southern Lebanon, killing 3 people and injuring others. The airstrike specifically targeted a Palestinian individual inside the apartment. Lebanese media confirmed the death of another victim from the attack. According to Lebanon's civil defense, the number of deaths from the Israeli raid on the residential apartment has reached 3. Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam has emphasized the need for maximum pressure on Israel to halt its ongoing attacks on various Lebanese regions. In a statement, Salam condemned the Israeli targeting of Sidon, southern Lebanon, calling it an attack on civilians and a violation of Lebanese sovereignty. He stressed that this assault breaches UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and security agreements, urging for a complete cessation of military operations. An Israeli airstrike on Sidon in southern Lebanon has killed a senior Hamas leader, Hassan Farhat, along with his son and daughter, despite a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Hamas confirmed the assassination, calling it a cowardly act. Farhat, who was responsible for launching rockets at Israeli forces, was targeted in his apartment. The Israeli military said it would continue operations against Hamas wherever they operate. In Damascus, Syrian television has reported Israeli airstrikes targeting the Al-Kiswar area in the southwest of the capital. It was also reported that an explosion hit the capital, with authorities currently investigating its nature. That came a day after the Israeli occupation forces launched multiple attacks targeting military capabilities in Damascus, Hama, and Homs in central Syria. Houthi-affiliated media has reported that U.S. airstrikes targeted sites in Sada in northwest Yemen. That comes as the United States renews strikes on Houthi positions in Sada, continuing the offensive in the region. Moving on to Brussels, where NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has confirmed that allies received a clear message from the U.S. Secretary of State about Washington's commitment to the alliance. He emphasized the importance of ensuring security and stability for member states. The focus of discussions also included strengthening Ukraine's military and rallying more European support for its future defense capabilities. He highlighted that the ball is in Russia's court regarding a ceasefire and stressed the need to prevent future attacks on European nations.
In order to meet the very real demand for more defense capabilities. Over the last 2 days, we met among allies and with partners. We were joined by our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived at NATO headquarters for the second day of meetings on April 4th. Earlier, Rubio affirmed America's unwavering commitment to NATO. His reassurances have eased concerns among allies, emphasizing that the U.S. will not compromise on the interests of red lines of Ukraine and Europe. This commitment strengthens the alliance and ensures continued support for regional stability. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that setting preconditions for ending the conflict in Ukraine will be ineffective. Rubio emphasized that the only viable solution to ending the conflict is through negotiation. He also reaffirmed that the United States has public commitments to work with NATO in combating terrorism. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has announced that NATO allies are on track to spend more than 3% of their GDP on defense, thanks to commitments from many European countries, including Germany. Baerbock emphasized that this spending will enhance security for both Europe and the transatlantic region, extending to the Indo-Pacific. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly has stated that the relationship between the US and Canada will be permanently changed following US President Donald Trump's announcements of new tariffs on April 2nd. She emphasized that Canada will continue to pressure the US administration to reach a fair trade deal, including the imposition of counter tariffs on autos. Joly also called for a deadline for Russia to agree to a Ukraine ceasefire, stressing that consequences must follow if Russia refuses.
They want to do things differently, and we understand that.
Now to the United States. President Donald Trump has said that Britain is happy with US tariff decisions. That comes as Britain expressed optimism about a trade deal, hoping to mitigate the impact of Trump's tariffs, which could lead to a global trade war. Britain faced the lowest import duty rate of 10%, a move the UK sees as validation for its strategy for a new economic partnership, despite concerns over a sluggish economy vulnerable to global slowdowns. China has announced new tariffs and restrictions on US goods in response to President Trump's tariffs. Starting on April the 10th, China will impose an additional 34% tariff on all US goods. Beijing also enacted export controls on rare earth elements, including samarium and dysprosium, to the US. Additionally, 11 foreign entities were added to China's unreliable entity list, allowing punitive actions against them. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has stated that the US-EU tariff negotiations should focus on eliminating all tariffs, not increasing them. She emphasized her opposition to retaliatory tariffs, advocating for the removal of all barriers to trade. Meloni had previously described the US trade tariffs as a mistake, but warned against overestimating their impact, urging a thoughtful and measured response. Well, that's almost all for now, but let's recap the main headlines this afternoon. The UN calls for an investigation into targeting aid workers. US Senator urges halt to offensive weapons sales to Israel. And Lebanon calls for exerting pressure on Israel to end repeated attacks. That's all for now, but don't forget you can follow Q News 24/7 on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at QNews EGY. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more updates. In Depth is on the way next. Have a good day.